Well, good evening, my friends. Thank you for joining me for Last Days Live. I am so thankful to have you along. Bitter cold winter's night here. And did you see my shirt? Look at my shirt. Arkansas. Got my Arkansas shirt on tonight. You know why I got my Arkansas shirt on? Because I'm proud of Arkansas. Yeah, we went red, and I am so thankful for that. If your state went blue today, I'd like for you to ask yourself why. And perhaps you need to up the work level or whatever it may be. I'm not suggesting that that I'm all that. But there were several years ago, wasn't that long ago in my lifetime, that Arkansas was a very blue state, and it was gonna go Democrat no matter what. And there's a lot of work done by a lot more people, other folks than myself, but a lot of work done to make sure that Arkansas went conservative. But yeah, it looks like the Electoral College is going to go Biden. And some of our states who acted rather cowardice, and I think some of our Christians who acted rather cowardice, they are going to, I think, need to give an account for why they allowed so much to be ahead of what is going to become a bloodbath, because you know that's what Biden and Harris are going to do. They're going to open the floodgates for abortion. What is going to become a homosexual hotbed, because you know that's what they're going to do. They've got to pander to the left with regards to those kind of values. And we're going to see the borders open. We're going to see more and more Muslims are going to come into our nation, and they're going to be more and more of an onslaught of false god worship, all those kind of things. And those who allowed the pandemic to cause them to be very cowardice in the way that they went about things and helped Biden get into office as they did. I think you're going to have to pay for that, as far as recognizing where you're at and repenting of it. And that's just my thoughts on it. I've lost some friends with regards to that kind of thing, but I'm just telling you, folks, we're living in the last days. It's time for some of us to put our house in order and be ready to go more than we are clawing and just doing everything possible to stay here. Hi, Margie. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm grateful. We've got a lot of good stuff to talk about tonight, but before we get there, I want to share with you a real important announcement. The MAP School of Biblical Studies, which has been in progress for several years, I'm really thankful that I had an opportunity to teach. My dad got an opportunity to teach. My wife, Kathy, others have got an opportunity to teach that. But we're having a transition at MAP, largely brought on by the new normal, if you want to call it that. And my oldest son, Bryson, and a very dear friend of mine, Clayton Steiner, are going to be taking over as far as the directorship of MAP is concerned. And they're going a little bit of a different direction than the School of Biblical Studies. Now, there will be, I'm told they're hoping to do some online things, etc., but it's not going to really be the School of Biblical Studies. So I decided that instead of just allowing that opportunity to go by the wayside, that I was going to take it up. But we're going to call it the Restoration School of Biblical Studies. It's going to come under the purview of my personal ministry. Cindy and I and Gabriel and others are going to work tirelessly to make this thing happen. But I just wanted you to know that coming January the 3rd, there will be a School of Biblical Studies, but it's going to be, again, relative to my personal ministry, and it's going to be called the Restoration School of Biblical Studies. The reason I'm calling it Restoration is because I think that we are desperate in America to get back to the absolute truth, and that's going to be core to this idea. You see those pictures that are there on the left? Those pictures represent the various classes, the 5 classes that will be offered this coming quarter. It's not necessary if you take all 5. In fact, I would recommend that if you're a first-time student, don't take all 5, because I've noticed that a lot of our students get overwhelmed and they struggle with that. I just grab one of them that really interests you. There will be 12 lessons over 12 weeks. We're going to divide the year into quarters. And so there'll be 12 lessons that will take place. And you can see that on Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock, we're going to begin a chapter-by-chapter survey of the book of Genesis, which means that in this first quarter, you're only going to get the 12 chapters of Genesis, the first 12 chapters of Genesis. There's I think, 52 of them, and so it's going to take all year for us to cover that. Then on Sunday nights at 5 o'clock, that's a time when we stop and we look at a verse-by-verse study of the book of Revelation. Then on Monday nights, Last Days, we're going to change the title just a little bit, just tweak it slightly, Last Days Topics. And in this particular quarter, we're going to look at establishing your own home church. How do you home church? What's that about? And then on Wednesdays at 5 o'clock, notice the time change there. We're going to go to 5 o'clock instead of 5:30. I'm trying to keep everything consistent. At 5 o'clock on Wednesday nights, we're going to look at a verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Corinthians. And then last time, you might recall that the reading assignment was my dad's book you can know that there's a God and the Bible is his word, etc., etc. And we're working really hard to get that thing published for you so you can buy that. Well, this coming first quarter, it's going to be marital blisters. I wrote this particular book years ago, and it has to do with avoiding a lot of marital problems and how you can do that. Anyhow, enough said of that. It's just an opening commercial to say that January the 3rd will begin a new quarter for the new Restoration School of Biblical Studies. Very, very excited about this. Cindy just today was working online trying to make sure that we had the right company that was available so we can archive our lessons, etc., etc. Please, please pray about this and consider joining us, okay? Second thing I wanted to announce before we get into our subject matter this evening is remember what we're doing. I'm trying to make sure that we have a Q&A at the conclusion. And so every time, other than Sunday mornings at Lord's Day Live, can't do that because of time constraints, but all the other live things that I do, I'm hoping to have a Q&A period at the conclusion. That will allow me to stop, look at the comments on the right, and actually go through them and deal with them in detail rather than trying to maintain all of that while I'm actually giving the lesson. So if you got comments about what I'm about to say, and some of it's going to be rather controversial, type her in there, and we'll try to deal with that as we move along. All right. Tonight we want to look at Romans chapter 11, verses 17 through 18, grafting and sharing. I think I told you a few weeks ago that the pattern we're going to take right up until the end of the year is this now what? Stop and ask directions. And I've just been praying all week long that God would lead me to a particular passage that should be on my heart. This is where I was this week in Romans chapter 11, verses 17 through 18, with the subject matter of grafting and sharing in the lifeblood of the tree itself. Romans chapter 11 talks about the Christian being grafted into the root, which is Israel. The Old Testament scenario is there's a merging that's happening here. It's a very important merging. And I think that merging might help us understand some things with regards to the controversy that rages with regards to pre-trib rapture, as they would call it. I don't use that term. Pre-trib caught up. In other words, the early exit of the church. Is that going to happen? I'll just say right up front, I hope so. I really want it to happen. And as things begin to swirl and as we begin to see what's taking place, the compromises that a lot of Christians are making and with their values, and thus we got a Biden-Harris, in the White House, it seems. All of that kind of stuff starts to swirl, and we're beginning to see even more persecution that's going to come down upon the church, I'm convinced. As that happens, there's going to be more folks who are going to be focusing on, but the church is going to be out of here, right? We're not going to have to put up with this much longer because God's going to take us out. And it's kind of an escapism doctrine that, honestly, I'm all for. I hope that that's the case, but the thing that upsets me is that there are so many who are posting things with it seems to me just an ultimate confidence that, hey, we're going to be out of here before things get bad, so just don't worry about it. And I think it's because of that and a lot of the carnal conveniences we've amassed to ourselves in the church today. It's because of that the church is very soft, and it really, really concerns me. So again, here's where we're going. I'm about to throw the slide up there that will actually show you the text, but that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Are you ready? Here we go. All right, there it is. Romans chapter 11, verses 17 through 18 says this: but if some of the branches were broken off, and he's talking about Israel, if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. There is they call it replacement theology, and this particular line of thought, which I don't share, but this particular line of thought is that when the church came along, it replaced Israel. Now, the reason I don't agree with that is because I don't think they are taking into consideration fully what's happening in Romans chapter 11. What happens when the church comes about is more of a unity and a blending than it is a replacement. But because there is a narrative, often promoted by the premillennial world, because there is a narrative with regards to this, it's an easy kind of a criticism to make towards the amillennial folks, I call them present millennial folks, that they are preaching a replacement theology. Now, I believe there are those who actually preach that, okay? Don't get me wrong, okay? And a lot of them exist and probably are even predominant within the present millennial group, okay? I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but what I am saying is that I think we need to be very careful, because even though I share a lot of the convictions with the present millennial group, I'm certainly not one who promotes this idea of a replacement theology. That is, that the church came along and replaced. What I think, in fact, I think the equation's completely off. I think that what happened was that as the church comes along, it becomes not the replacement of, but the blending of. That's what the church actually is. The church blended both the ancient Israel kind of a setting, that's the root, the old law, all of that kind of thing, brought us to a point. And so, and you'll even notice that for a very long time, early on in the church, it was primarily Jewish people, okay? Then we got Acts chapter 10 comes along, story of Cornelius, all of those things, and we see that all of a sudden there's going to be this opening, and then Paul's going to become the apostle to the Gentiles, and he's going to travel the known world, and we're going to have many thousands of Gentiles are going to be converted, and hundreds of churches are going to be established all across the Gentile world, and there is not a replacement, there is a blending. Because as this passage clearly says, we are individuals at this stage in human history, we are individuals that have benefited from the nourishment that was being given to the root or comes from the root system, okay? But to be fair, if you're going to really look at biblical history, the fact of the matter is that Israel also benefits from a root system that pre-existed before Abraham. And so before Abraham, the father of the Jew, the father of the faithful, whatever, before he even comes on the scene, there is already a relationship that God has with the world. And it's a predominant relationship of I want everyone, John 3:16, I want everyone to be able to have the opportunity to come to redemption, all right? Abraham comes along, God says, I recognize. In fact, let me just throw that up there. Let's see if I can throw, yeah, there it is. I probably need to move that just a little bit so you can see it better. This is actually the timeline of biblical history. And it's the focus, if you will, the emphasis of God as he moves through biblical history. You'll notice the first 2,000 years approximately, that is creation to Abraham, that his emphasis is on all of humanity. Then at Abraham, there's a special covenant made with the folks who will become what we call the Jews. There's a special covenant made with the family of Abraham that because of your seed, your family, your lineage, the Christ will come. And so during those middle 2,000 years, God focuses in on the Jew. But when Christ came, the focus began to shift, and rightly so, because what God has always wanted was all of humanity to come to him. That's what he's always wanted. The end game has never been just the Jew. The end game has never been just, if you will, the Christian. The end game has always been all the faithful, okay? But you can't get there unless you go through Christ. Okay, and thus the Christian is significant to that. And what is the group that we call a bunch of the church, right? And so what you have in the church is you've got individuals who have Jewish history and Gentile history. But they come together and they then blend to become the church, all right? Now, let's come back to my top frame here, and I need to come through that and then I'll show you another one here in just a second. I want you to notice two very important words in this text. They're in yellow here. Notice that that is the Gentile, me and you, probably most of you who are watching, we are grafted in. You can see that picture on the right there. That's a picture I drew years ago of supposedly a limb that is being grafted into the side of a tree. And it's just supposed to represent to you Romans chapter 11, that the theme here is that we have been unified, blended in, if you will. It doesn't in any way take away the importance of the root. Paul's pretty clear about that in this passage. Read on in the rest of the passage that I don't have before you, and you're going to see that, all right? It doesn't take anything away from that. It builds on to it. And that's very important for us to recognize. Because notice the next word in yellow. We were grafted in among the others and now share. You see why I'm using the word blend here? It's not that we were grafted in among the others and now replace. It's that we are grafted in among the others and now share. The purpose of the church was to bring two groups together. For 2,000 years, it was just the Jew. The Gentile could come to God, but to get there, he had to be a proselyte. He had to come through, it seems, the Jewish system of things, the law and all of that. But now things have changed. You no longer, in fact, that's the point, is it not, of Acts chapter 15. You no longer have to become a Jew before you can become a Christian, right? That was the point of Acts chapter 15. And so we have to recognize that although our history is important and we don't want to erase it, it's the root from which we get our nutrients. It doesn't mean, though, that there isn't a branch that hasn't been grafted in that is very, very significant to the process. In fact, I make two conclusions. You see them at the bottom there of the black screen. Some of the branches were broken off, he says in this passage. I conclude then this: the cleansing of Israel directly involves the grafting in of Christians. I believe that the cleansing of Israel, notice the passage, how it seems to be saying some branches get broken off, and for whatever reason, I think it's because they got some branches broken off, God then is going to graft in others. I believe that the two are dependent upon each other, and I think this is going to play into this pre-trib theory. The second conclusion I draw from this passage is, notice the phrase, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in. It's interesting how it says this. We are a wild olive shoot. Both of them are olives, okay? It seems. But in this one, it's a wild olive that is grafted into the root, okay? Now, why? And here's my conclusion. In order for the ultimate goal of God to be complete, that is redeeming all of the world, John 3:16, the blending of the Jew and the Gentile had to happen. That middle 2,000 years was very significant, but it was not the end game. The end game was always that we would refocus on the world. Now, how does that play in then to the concept of the pre-trib exit? They would call it rapture. The pre-trib calling out of the church. How does that play in? Well, let's just go here to this second frame, and maybe I can describe what I think is happening. Again, remember that we've got a group that has been grafted in, the Gentiles, and therefore they now share. He makes the point at the end, does he not? Because you're grafted in, don't get arrogant about being better than the root. I think that's one area that we got to really be consider with regards to present millennialists. I think there is somewhat of an arrogance there. We got to be careful not to have that kind of an arrogance. But at the same time, it doesn't say then that we don't have a grafting in. We certainly do. And therefore, I think that the reverse is also true. The Jew ought not get arrogant against that which was grafted in. God wanted him grafted in, so the Jew needs to just take it, appreciate it, and recognize, I think, according to what I said in the first part, I think it was part of the process of giving the Jew the cleansing, giving Israel the cleansing. So how does this relate then to the idea of the pre-tribulation rapture or caught up experience? Well, I've been running a rabbit in my own personal studies recently with regards to the book of Revelation that to me is quite profound. You might not find it to be quite as exciting as I do, but I just think it's really profound. A blending brought about within the church. That's what I think was the goal of God throughout all of this. And when we get to heaven, we're going to find that those who are in heaven are going to be a group of faithful, all right? And that faithful could rightly be called the ecclesia. The reason they're faithful is because they deserted something that was unfaithful. Thus, they were called out, set apart, sanctified. This idea of ecclesia. And so I think it's reasonable to conclude that even those Old Testament individuals like the Abrahams, the Moseses, the Davids, the etc., even those individuals will rightly be referred to in the future as the church. Because they are the called out. Now, we may not call them that in heaven. I don't have a clue what we'll call them. It may just be the bride of Christ, which will be just fine with me. But we're all part of a system that was in place throughout human history. And that is that God wanted the called out. He wanted the faithful. He wanted those. Ever since we left the garden, he wanted to find out who were the folks who were actually going to stand with him and not walk off into paganism, okay? And that's what the church is supposed to be. So I believe that what actually has taken place is not a replacement, but a blending that ends up becoming the church. Watch Revelation chapter 4. Here's just 4 illustrations of this that I think is really rather interesting. Now, I didn't have space, so I need you to read the passages on your own. But I am forever being told that the church itself, particularly, is not found in the middle chapters of the book of Revelation. Everybody, especially premillennials, say, I always like to go there. The church is not found. The church is not found. They'll say that repeatedly. Now, what is true is that the word church is not found in the middle chapters of Revelation. I have no argument with that because it isn't there. It is, by the way, found at the beginning and at the end. In fact, Jesus says at the end he wrote it specifically for the church, not for the left behind. He wrote it for the church. There's a reason that the church needs to know what's going on during the Great Tribulation. I ask you, why is that? Jesus specifically says in the last chapter he wrote it for the church, not the left behind, the church. And so why does the church need to know? If we're caught up, we're caught out, we're not even here to operate under what he said. Why does the church even need to know this stuff? I have come to the conviction that the church does show up in the middle chapters of the book of Revelation. It doesn't by name in the Greek word ecclesia, I get that, but it certainly does by description, I think. In Revelation chapter 4, this is the throne room of heaven. You'll notice that there are 24 elders who are constantly falling on their faces, casting their crowns before the throne. Why 24? Why not 12? Well, because it seems, and most scholars tend to agree with it, it seems that the number 24 here, which is two 12s put together, probably represents the 12 tribes of Israel, and, can you think of any 12 in the church? The 12 apostles. And when you put 12 and 12 together, those two things, do you not see a blending here? In Revelation chapter 4, right after Revelation chapter 3, where we ended the letters to the churches and we got the one to Laodicea, we go right into a throne room scene, and it's like the church continues to be a part of that setting, okay? I do believe that the church is part of the middle chapters of the book of Revelation. And I believe that 24 elders is indicative of that, but that's not the only one. You move deeper into the middle section of Revelation, and you see Revelation chapter 7. This is where you got the 144,000 and the innumerable crowd that comes out of the Great Tribulation. It's interesting that those two groups are described back to back. First, you got the 144,000 who are sealed. And by the way, we had a program on this several weeks ago, but remember, they are not the classic tribes of Israel. Dan is missing, and we have got Manasseh rather than Manasseh, and Ephraim's missing. Manasseh is added in. That's a grandson, not a son. Joseph appears, and it's not even the classical list of the tribes that are supposed to inherit the promised land, because, again, Dan is missing. Manasseh is listed, but his brother Ephraim is not listed. Instead, Joseph is listed, as well as Levi is listed, and Levi didn't have a land inheritance. So whatever you do with the 144,000, it's important to you to recognize it's not the classic list of the tribes of Israel, okay? Does it represent Israel? I think it does. I don't have any problem with that. For whatever reason, the Lord decided to tweak that list so that we would have an idea. Perhaps it was for this very conversation, so that we would recognize that what's happening here is not the classic list of the Old Testament. But whatever you do with that, I believe that 144,000 does represent Israel. I mean, it actually says that in the text. But then you got to deal with the innumerable crowd. Who do they represent? If you study the text, it says these are the folks who had their garments washed in the blood of the Lamb. Does that not sound very... It sounds a lot like baptism. It sounds like the New Testament kind of a concept of being baptized with Jesus, Romans 6, 3, and 4, and coming in contact with the blood of Christ. I think Revelation chapter 7 is talking about Christians and Israel coming together to form the church. And we got a blending that takes place there. But there's more. Revelation chapter 8. I was just studying this past weekend. Really interesting passage. In Revelation chapter 8, we have the seventh seal that has been opened. And the seventh seal gives us, we've got a short period of time in heaven where there is silence, okay? And then after that, we have an altar scene. And we've got incense that is being mingled with the prayers of the saints. Incense is very much an Old Testament imagery of ancient Hebrew worship. And saints, that's a term that is often used of the church. I think Revelation chapter 8 is actually also referring to the blending of Israel and Christians to form the church. Not a replacement, a blending. And then Revelation chapter, there's probably more, but these are the ones that just popped off the screen at me real fast. Revelation chapter 11, the two witnesses. I'm often told that these two witnesses have to be Jews because they are referred to in the imagery, they're referred to as olive trees. The reason that really, really bugs me is because they are intentionally leaving out the second imagery that is also describing these guys. The second imagery is that they're not just olive trees, they're also what? Lampstands. Do you remember what the church was described as being in Revelation chapter 1? Do you remember what Jesus said of his followers, that we would be the light of the world? Really bugs me when folks go to the two witnesses and they say they have to be Jews because they're olive trees, but they completely circumvent the second imagery, which is lampstands. Again, in Revelation chapter 11, it seems pretty clear to me, we've got a blending of both Israel and Christian to form what? The ecclesia, the church. And it's for that reason that I would like to suggest to you that we have got to be really careful during these last days not to dilute the importance of the church, possibly even through the Great Tribulation. It just seems remarkable to me that there are individuals who believe that the Holy Spirit, and they believe that, many folks believe that the restrainer will be removed, and they believe the restrainer is the Holy Spirit. It's just remarkable to me that they think that the restrainer is going to be removed and the church is going to be removed prior to the greatest revival on the planet. I struggle with that. I really do. I do not know when we're going to be caught up. I can't give you specific time, the time frame with regards to all of that kind of thing. But I am definitely leaning more solidly toward a mid-trib than I am ever a pre-trib. And I think that it's important, even if I'm wrong. Think about this one, if you will. Even if I am wrong, and I pray that I am, because I want to be out of here. But even if I am wrong, it does not hurt us to prepare. It doesn't hurt us to have our lamps trimmed and ready. It doesn't hurt us to have ourselves in a situation where if we have to continue through difficult times, I can still be faithful. It doesn't hurt us to go there. In fact, I think at the end of the day, the Lord might very well say to you and I, who are resisting the assumed certainty of a pre-trib exit of the church, I think he might say, I really appreciate you going the extra mile there just to make sure. Being that it's a book of mystery and I recognize that you couldn't know everything, I really appreciate you for really going. It's like the 5-talent man, isn't it? It doesn't hurt you and I to question a pre-trib exit, even to assume that a pre-trib exit is not going to happen. It just doesn't hurt. What I don't want to start for you to see out of me is preaching that it won't be a pre-trib exit. I don't know. I'm not going to preach to you that it's going to be a mid-trib exit. I don't know. It could even be a post-trib exit. I simply don't know. But what I want you to know is that whatever it is, we have to, as Christians, stop being so soft and prepare for whatever the road we got to go down. Last illustration, I've used it many, many times, but it's very important, I think, and I think it's very, very apropos to what we're talking about. Everybody likes to say, Jesus would never let the bride go through such a thing. And it just does not equate. He has allowed his bride to go through all kinds of tribulation since the time the church was even formed. But they're going to say, yeah, but that wasn't God's wrath on the world. I get that. But what about the last plague of Egypt? That was God's wrath upon Egypt. And the people that were saved from that plague, those were God's people. Did they go through the plague, although protected by God? They most certainly did. You know that night in those villages, as little babies were found stillborn, and as the firstborn, lost his life, you know that there were howls and weepings and cryings that went up. And you know that the faithful who were protected under the blood of the Lamb, they heard that. And if they didn't that night, they certainly heard about it the next morning. Yes, they traveled through the difficulties of God's wrath, albeit they were protected from it. Why couldn't that same consistent, because we know God's consistent, why couldn't that same consistent pattern be true of the Great Tribulation? That we would travel through it for the very purpose that the ancient Hebrews traveled through the last plague of Egypt. And that is to show faithfulness, to show the importance of the blood of the Lamb. Why couldn't that be true for us during the Great Tribulation? I just don't understand why. I'm happy to have anybody comment. I don't have any questions, it doesn't seem, with regards to that. But like I said, we're going to end each of these things with a Q&A. So anybody got a thought on that? All right, now, I want to end as I've been trying to do each night with this particular series with a story. You're familiar with this story, I suspect, but the teacher was welcoming her students into class for the last day of VBS. They had a wonderful week. It's just been wonderful. They've been talking about the church and good things that the church does and all that. And one of the activities that they had done throughout the week is something you probably did. Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors. Oops, I did that backwards. Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see, oh, I didn't have any people in my church. You probably did that. Well, the teacher taught that to the little ones. And it was the last day of VBS, and they had already started class, and a knock came to the door, and it was a visitor. And the little guy, he was embarrassed, head down, all of those kind of things, because he had been in situations like this before. Everybody pointed, everybody talked. He was born with only one arm, and he knew what it was going to be like. And so as he entered the classroom, the teacher, recognizing the awkwardness of the moment, she ushered him into a seat and then just immediately got into the class so that all the attention would be taken off of him. And she did a really good job. The entire class period, she kept the attention off of him, and he was even feeling more comfortable and laughing with the other kids and that kind of thing. And she thought, oh, I've done it. And she kind of lost herself in her thought process towards the end of the class, and she knew it was about to, the bell was about to ring, and she said, okay, guys, everybody stand up around the table. We'll do our activity one last time, all right? Put your hands together. You go, one last, here we go. Here's the church, here's the... And she got to that point, and she recognized what she had done. The little guy, the visitor, only had one arm, and there was no way for him to participate in their last activity. But in the middle of that silence, in the middle of that crazy awkwardness, little Susie jumped up from the other side of the table, and she rushed around, and she said, teacher, it's okay. Johnny and I can make our church together. And she put her left hand into his right hand, and here's the church, here's the steeple. Open the doors and see all the people. I think it's time for some of us in the pre-millennial and present millennial world to come together. And I think it's time for us to celebrate the joy of celebrate the phenomenal blessing of not a replacement theology, but a blending theology. And I'm concerned that when we don't do that, we undermine the very reason God has put the human timeline in place. He did it for such a time as this, to bring us to a time when all of us would have the opportunity to be part of the ecclesia. I think that's important. Well, what else do we got? I got you that story in. Now we go to the Q&A. I'm looking back here. So Margie's with me, my mom's with me, and she says that Helen's with me, but she's not. Helen didn't comment on my thing, Mom, so I didn't know that. But if that's Helen, I love her, and I'm so thankful that Helen is here. So all of you who have joined in with me, thank you, thank you, thank you. Let me just say it one more time. We're hoping to do this regularly. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A, and so just type in your questions as we're going along here so that if you got something and we can cover it, and you can teach me as easy as I can teach you. I'd love to have you do that. So if you got a thought, let me know. By the way, before I end that, Dad, did you have a thought? My dad's sitting over there. Did you have a thought that you wanted to bring up with Q&A? Okay. All right. Dad's often really good about that, having something to say. Don't forget that here are the live things that we are doing present tense. And I want you to be a part of that. All of those are pretty much going to stay the same, except for... let me just explain. The top left-hand corner, that's Lord's Day Live. That's going to become our Genesis study. Lord's Day Live will continue. Don't be afraid of that. But the Bible class during Lord's Day Live is going to be our Genesis study, chapter by chapter. Last Day Live, that's Revelation, 2 Corinthians, etc. Holy Hope and Humor, that's going to stay. But you might put it down if you're interested that on Wednesdays, the 2 Corinthians study is going to be moving to 5 o'clock. After the first of the year, all right? For the rest of this year, it'll stay at 5:30, but for the rest of the year, it's gonna go at 5 o'clock. So let me just do that one last time, throw this thing up here for you. Oops, what did I do? You got too much stuff up there. You guys can't have all that up there. You can't see what's happening. How about this? One more time. Don't forget the Restoration School of Biblical Studies. I need you to pray about it. There are the 5 classes that will be offered during the first quarter. Love to have all, and there's no charge. I'd love to have all of you join me and be a part of that, okay? What's the last thing we do? I think it's this one, isn't it? Let's just see if I can throw it up there. I'm confident that's it, but I just can't make it come up there. There it is. Keep your eyes on the skies. I hope it's soon, but he is coming. Keep your family close, homemaker vigilant, watch on the conditions, and investments in heaven. Because at the end of the day, you think about it, at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is that you and your family will be there. Know what I'm saying? Matthew 16:26.